Recording and Audacity in 3, 2, 1.
Hi, guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Barbell Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Lynn, and I'm here with my co host, Marissa Roy. And in today's episode, we're doing part two of our How We Would Coach You series. So if you haven't listened to part one, definitely recommend that you start there and then go from there.
Yeah. So just as a recap, how we're doing this series is we're really just kind of, talking and jamming back and forth until we hit a stopping point for being able to record. But just taking you through, like, if you were our client, like, what are the steps and the progressions typically that we will take someone through? Now, granted, that's where individualization comes in of like your journey might not look exactly like this, but I think a lot of people, if you really wanted to, could take exactly what we're saying, take down notes, follow it to a T, and probably get pretty close to where you want to be. If you are willing to do that legwork, which is where a lot of times people just don't, and they want to pay for the convenience, which is also fine. That's where you hire a coach. But where we left off was we had finished talking about how to set like foundations up, essentially, was before you jump into, and the mistake a lot of people make is they do what we're going to teach in this episode first, and they just jump right into like, let's track some macros. Let's get into a calorie deficit. Let's do this fat loss thing. And this part two episode is probably going to be more formulaic by nature. And a lot of times, I don't know, type A women, like really perfectionistic, really go-getter types, like this sort of thing. We like to see like, okay, here's how I make progress, the data, the numbers, the progress. But a lot of the sustainability is found in part one of the intangibles, the foundations, the routines, and your life. But if you've got all that covered, or maybe you generally live a very healthy lifestyle and you have balanced nutrition and you've covered all those things in episode one, then we can get into how do we set up fat loss? You want to start?
Yeah. So this was so actually this happened today where I got I don't know how this part of my website is still working. But someone paid for like a macro consultation,
Oh
which we
God.
don't, yeah, which we definitely don't do anymore. But I was looking at, this person isn't tracking macros, and I looked at, what they eat in a 24-hour period. And my initial reaction was, wow, macros are definitely not the place to start for this
Yeah.
client. Because again, that I can tell that the foundation is not there, and it does not make sense to jump into macro. So absolutely do, even if you feel like I'm someone who's like, yeah, I'm pretty healthy, I know what I'm doing, I still would recommend listening to that part one. You might
Yeah.
get some nuggets or some takeaways, because
Yeah.
if you just jump into part two and you don't have a strong foundation, I mean, that example, like it's going to crumble, and like you're going to get to the top and you're going to get to a point where it's just not really going to last, because we really, really need that foundation. So if you have that, if you feel like, again, your hydration, your sleep, your, all of those like healthy habits that you have in place, now let's jump into protocol. So there are two different realms, and I kind of talked about this a little bit in part one, like where we would take someone, because we have some people who do need to build their calories up, and we cannot jump into a fat loss phase right away. And so we may need to reverse diet, build them back up. And I always like the little caveat with, just because we're not diving into what is considered your typical fat loss phase does not mean that you will not see progress during
Yeah.
this. And actually, a lot of times we will see a lot of progress. This is going to set you up for even more success. So that's the different way. We had to build up their calories, or we have someone who they're eating very well. Their calories are pretty high. They haven't been trying to lose weight for a while. That's someone who we still probably wouldn't dive into a fat loss phase right away. We'd still want to give them specific macros and just kind of see how they do with maybe even just changing their percentages around, and just seeing like what we can do if we up, this here. Like typically we increase protein a little bit. We might keep fat and carbs just a little bit more steady and just see what happens. We don't, there is very, very rarely, I don't think if ever, that we would take someone directly into a fat loss phase right away, because There's just, I mean, because at least for us, we want to see the data of like, we want to see how you respond when you're working with us for like at least a couple weeks first, and then kind of see where we can go from there. Even if someone comes to us and says that they've been tracking for a while, we still kind of want to see how they respond with our protocols and like our foundational phase. So that would kind of be the two options. And then yeah, if everything is going really well and maybe you are not responding to like the initial changes, then we would go into a traditional deficit to start losing the weight.
Yeah, definitely. Not much different here. I'll just echo the parts that are the same of like, because if you listen to part one, I think something that you can also get out of this episode is to see how two different coaches might have slightly varying approaches to the same outcome. But I would say, yeah, we've built that foundation. And like, what does that look like, right? We've got multiple balanced meals across the day that are centered around a lean protein source. We're eating when we're hungry, we're stopping when we're full. And so the most likely scenario is that calories have gone from you're kind of honestly, I think the biggest problem that I see is women tend to undereat. And because they undereat, then they overeat sometimes. And that just totally throws things out of whack. So just creating the consistency of those meals, snacks in between alone can really build calories up without us even having tracked yet and build protein up. But then typically what we find is even with just that, like maybe we've been able to lose some pounds and some inches just from those changes alone. We start getting into, okay, now let's quantify this. How much are we actually eating? And we'll start to gain awareness over, okay, now I'm going to track this in MyFitnessPal versus just building out my plates. And I might realize that, I thought I was getting this much protein, but I wasn't. Or I thought I was getting this many carbs or fat, but I wasn't. And then we can kind of start to tweak. But we'll typically tweak it by just like starting with a protein goal of, okay, now here's the protein goal. We found out that with this eating structure and these foundations, you're getting like 90 grams of protein per day. I'd love to see that at 120 or whatever it is. But the target is typically going to be 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of your body weight or target body mass. So if you have like a lot of weight to lose, like I would say, anywhere from like 50 plus pounds of weight to lose, you're not going to want to set your protein intake on your current body weight. Because it's not really representative of how much skeletal muscle mass you actually have, right? So more so centering that goal around like what your target body weight would be. And so 0.8 to 1 gram per pound of that. Start with the 0.8 if you're already still really far off of that, and then just kind of scaffold and bring that up over time. So we might just like start with tracking just that and just that alone. What kind of tends to happen is your appetite gets better regulated, your blood sugar gets better regulated, the more you increase your protein and have these regular meals throughout the day. And you're probably building your calories up a little by little anyways by doing that. And then from there, we'll kind of set the calorie goal of like, okay, we got protein, and now let's add in the calorie goal to make some sense of like, okay, right now it might be fluctuating a little bit more. Let's put a little consistency to that. So we might have a calorie goal of, whatever it is, plus or minus 100. So they might, at this point, have built up to maybe 1,600 calories plus or minus 100. And so we're trying to hit between 15 and 1,700. And then we gain some consistency and some traction in that. And then we'll start to either build that up a little bit or transition into all three macronutrients, depending on like what that person really needs from there. And so again, building up the calories just so that we're in a place where it actually makes sense to where if we hit a plateau, we need to cut back, then we can. And so a lot of times just getting a little bit more granular at a time starts to create a lot of body recomposition, body fat loss, change all at once. So yeah, basically just seeing like, oh wow, if I just increase my protein over time, like I've noticed that I've just been feeling leaner, losing weight. And then when we get some consistency in the calories day to day, oftentimes a lot of cravings go down, food focus goes down because it's like, wow, I'm actually consistently eating enough every day. This is wild. And then like Christina said, it's like when you change out ratios of like, let's say carbs and fat and protein all together, and you have a high protein diet with moderate fat and moderate to high carbs, you're going to really notice that your training performance improves in the gym. You're going to notice that you're going to have better energy throughout the day because you got lots of room to fit in lots of fruits, vegetables, and starchy carbohydrates with plenty of vitamins and minerals. So you're going to have all of these things. And basically, from there, we'll see a lot of changes in your body. And then, your calories might be at, for a woman, 2,000 to 2,500, depending on your activity level, is like all really great for a lot of women. And then from there, okay, now has our weight on average kind of stalled out over time? We should be tracking weight at this point throughout this kind of building into tracking phase, like daily, weigh in daily. It's tough, I know, but when you weigh in daily, you become more desensitized over time to the spikes and the peaks and the valleys that happen every single day. And we want to look at the average weight change and trend over time. Is it consistently trending downwards if you were to plot it on a graph? Or is it up and down around a certain set point? If you find that over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, that it's up and down around a certain set point rather than trending one way or the other, then that's going to give you information about where do I pull my calories, or do I have the ability to pull my calories? Some clients, we find that their weight is dropping a ton from these changes alone. And it's actually almost too fast to where like someone's losing, we want to lose anywhere around 1/2 a pound per week to up to 1% of your body weight. So if you're like 200 pounds, that could be 2 pounds a week. But if someone's losing 3 or 4 pounds a week because they're not eating enough, that's a signal of like, hey, this graph is plummeting too quick. Let's actually increase food a little bit more. Versus if somebody is going in the opposite direction, they're gaining weight or something like that, then we can decrease calories reliably, knowing like, okay, we have our data to show like this is pulling us in the wrong direction. So that's really how that iterative process really starts to come to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, we do the same thing as far as like building up to that point for tracking. And again, I know that we continue to harp on why the foundational phase is so important, because if you don't know how to have a balanced meal, if your sleep isn't there, if you don't know how to hydrate, and all we're manipulating is food intake, we're leaving a lot on the table as far as progress that we can see when you do enter into a fat loss phase. And so the reason that I kind of tell clients, if we're having an issue with, why are we not dieting? Why are we not doing this? Why, like, because they come into our program and they're like, I want to lose weight, I want to lose fat. So why am I not dieting? Because that's been their traditional thought process, is in order for me to lose weight, I have to exercise more and eat less, which is not their fault. That is the message that has been put out there for a very, very long time. So I don't blame anyone for that. And so we talk about like, hey, do you want to lose 5 pounds right away and right now? Or would you rather lose 10 to 15 to 20, like you originally came to us saying? You're like, well, I want to lose more. And you're like, cool. So we could diet, we could just dump your calories and up your cardio. And yeah, you'll lose some weight and you might see a little bit of progress. But like, if we just give it a little bit more time and we get these foundations set, again, the balanced meals, the hydration, the sleep, all these things, and we increase your food, or we start to change your macro protocols, or like however we're tracking, you're probably going to see progress, which is really exciting, that you're doing like the stuff that's not so sexy. um, but like you're gonna see changes, and like again, you're gonna have more energy, like you're gonna be sleeping better, your digestion is gonna improve, like all of these things. And then once we're in a really, really good place, fat loss is gonna be quote unquote like easier. It's gonna be a little bit easier for you, and it may not seem as hard as what you've done in the past. And so that's really, really what we're trying to set you up to do. Because again, a lot of women, and I know the same thing for you, they come to us and they've done these fad diets, they've done the Optavia, they've done the Noom, they've done all the, juice cleanses and everything. And they've always feel like it has to be really hard. It has to be really extreme, and I'm going to lose a lot of weight really, really fast. I'm not going to feel good. It's going to suck. And that's kind of what they think is going to happen when they come into the program. So when they're like, I just have to do this, but when they're like, what do you mean we're not doing cardio? What do you mean we're not dieting? Like you have these things in place, and a lot of our clients, like they come to us and they're like, I can't believe I'm losing weight and I'm eating so much food. I can't believe I'm losing weight and it feels easy. And that's not to say that it's not hard for some people, because it absolutely is, but it should feel a little bit easier when you do have that strong foundation in place. So I'm gonna get off my horse in my soapbox, but it is really, really important, and that's why we continue to harp on it. And so it's like once all those things are in place, then yes, we can start to really dive into macros and see what we can do. But again, if you dive straight into dieting, you're leaving a lot of progress on the table. So
Yeah.
that's why we structure everything the way that we do. So when we do dive directly into a fat loss phase, like we're gonna see a lot more progress because you've been primed and you're in a really, really, really good spot. So I think we've kind
Yeah.
of set everything up as far as like, okay, like we're dieting
Yeah.
at this point. Do you want to dive into that?
Well, one more thing on that, because it's just like, yeah, like I think so many women carry the belief that dieting is so hard because they're trying to do all that stuff at once versus
Right.
like, and also like a habit that's super underrated is just like learning how to regularly prioritize yourself. Is like
Mm-hmm.
that is something that like a lot of people in general are not doing. Actually, Aaron, my husband, shared a stat today. He said he listened to some podcast where the statistic said that um only 5% of people in the world are actively working on themselves, and only 10 to 15% actually think about it,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
So it's like just learning how to say yes to yourself with the smallest things is a habit that needs working on. So
Yeah.
like perspective, right? And then it's like, no wonder it's so fucking hard to like track macros and manage all this data and do all this stuff with like Noom and MyFitnessPal up front, because it's like you don't even have the habit of taking care of yourself. So yeah, of course it's hard. So that's why it's one more nail in the coffin of why foundations are important. And if you're listening to this podcast, you're part of that at least 15% thinking about it, which is amazing. And that's a huge step. And then maybe you're also part of that 5% who's doing something about it. So, I mean, just give yourself some credit there, and it's not an easy journey. So, anyways, yeah, we're losing fat now.
Yeah.
We're
Well, I want to share, I had a client, she came to me and she felt like, she couldn't lose weight. She was really, really struggling. She was having a really hard time. And then again, we set that foundation, we started dieting. She was seeing a ton of progress. And I remember she came to me and she was like, is there anything else I should be doing? And I'm like, no. Like, she was like, well, it just seems kind of easy now. And I'm like, yeah, that's how it should feel. Like, and of course, we'll troubleshoot along the way if things come up, but it's like that's how it should feel because you've done that work. And again, dieting is just like, well, these are just my habits now. This is just what I do. And so again, you're gonna make it a lot easier on yourself. So yeah, so we're dieting.
we're
Like you
dieting.
got it, where you've got the foundation now. You're like, all right, I got it.
Yeah. And
um,
let's say you're tracking your calories or your macros. So I think when it comes to dieting, I'll say this. You can you can diet without tracking. It's just going to be less reliable and predictable. And like, if you're going to go for it and you're going to do all these things, build up all these habits, just track the data for a little bit to get in and out of it faster versus trying to like intuitively diet, because it's going to save you time in the long run, even if the time that it takes to plug something in or do some math is tedious. Now it does get easier, but with that being said, you can track, I think, one of two ways. So like I'm always of the school of thought that you should do as little as humanly possible to get away with as much as possible, right? So as much progress as possible. So if you can get away with, you have a calorie target and then plus or minus within the range of 100 above or below. So like maybe that's like 1800 plus or minus 100 or 1600 plus or minus 100, and then a protein goal. And then maybe we look at fiber too for our fruits or vegetables, or we just have a goal around that. If you can do that and you can consistently do that, lose weight all the way to your goal, I think that that's great. If you can get away with that lack of detail, do it. Do that for as long as you can. And then if or when you hit a plateau, then dial it in to like a narrower range, maybe plus or minus 50 calories, and then trying to hit it a little bit more granular. And then if you still hit a plateau after that, then let's go into all three macronutrients: fats, carbs, protein, fiber, tracking all of it, hitting all of it, because it's like, why look at the extra detail if you don't have to? Because I guarantee you there's someone that's going to listen to this that's like got 100 pounds to lose, that you do not need to track all three macros. But maybe when you have 20 left, you will, right? So it's like just knowing you can chip away at it over time.
Yeah. And we have a really good episode, which we should probably redo, because I think it's one of our earlier ones, but we talked about like kind of like priming yourself for a fat loss phase. So one of the things that we kind of like to talk to our clients about is like, what are our expectations? Like what should we be expecting? Like what is the amount of time that we're going to be dieting? What do you have coming up? Like all of those things that we can kind of forecast. I think that that's really important, because sometimes people diet, but they don't really have an end date in mind. They don't have a target. They don't really know what they're shooting for. So I think that that's really important. And then not just like end date, but like, what are we expecting week to week? Like, what is this going to be
Yeah.
like? Because kind of like what you said, it's like we want to get in and get out. Like we don't want to diet forever, because you're going to plateau. You're going to have to push harder. And there comes a point where, yeah, we could push, but like, what's the return? And we've
Hmm.
talked about that in that episode. Um, but we don't want to diet forever. We want it to be a little bit quick. So one of the things that we do talk about is, like you said, it's like, hey, yeah, maybe we do track all three macros, but it's not going to be like we have to do this forever. It's just going to be like for, maybe 8 weeks or 12 weeks or 16 weeks or something, whatever, however long we think that we need to diet to reach your goals. Um, and then the other thing, it's like we might be hungry. Like we might get hungry, and like how do we combat that? What are some things that we do? How do we build in extra cardio? Or hey, if you're going on vacation, or if you have a work trip, like how are we going to combat those things that are up ahead? So kind of like forecasting a little bit. I think that that's helpful, because it doesn't feel like, okay, well, I'm dieting, but for how long? Like what are we
Yeah.
doing? I feel like that
Yeah.
really helps too.
End date and pace, right? So that zero
Hmm.
0.5 pounds per week to 1% of your body weight. A lot of people really find a great sweet spot between like 1 and 1.5 pounds per week. It's a great spot to be. It's a pace that you're like, I'm making progress, and it's not so fast that you have to be like super restrictive. But what I will say is, you think about it like a gradient with like an inverse relationship, I believe. So for example, if I turn the intensity up on how much I'm managing my diet and being very meticulous and maybe restricting calories a little bit more, then I'm going to see a faster return in my progress. But I can also do things the other way, where like if I'm just someone that's not comfortable with that, or like I'm not willing to give up certain things, then I can turn the intensity back and accept a slower rate of progress. It's just knowing going in, eyes wide open, right? Like know that like the intensity that you choose will reflect in the amount of progress that you see. And part of that is like you don't really have an understanding of what that balance is until you like do the tracking consistently enough to see the results or lack thereof. And then you're like, okay, this is how my body's responding in this fat loss phase. I'm going to take it as it is. And I want to cruise from here, or maybe I want to turn the dial up, or maybe I want to turn the dial down. So you have choice in that. But it does require just like that baseline level of consistency of like, I'm hitting these targets to know that this is working or this is not working. I think one mistake that a lot of people get into when they try to coach themselves is that they will kind of be like, this isn't working, when they're not being consistent enough. And we don't know what consistency looks like. Consistency is not easy. So like, that's why I give the example of like calorie range and protein goal, because that's the easiest to hit, because you have a lot of margin for error. But at a certain point, that margin for error doesn't fly anymore. So if you're tracking your macros and you have a target of, I'll throw out some random numbers: 50 grams of fat, 175 grams of carbs, and 130 grams of protein. If you're not hitting those targets within like at least like 10 grams above or below that target, like there's a big margin of error there. And so a certain amount of error plus the error that inherently comes in food and packaged foods, labeled foods, it could throw you out of a deficit if you're at a point in your journey where that matters enough. Let's say you're in those last 20 pounds, last 10 pounds, last 5 pounds. Like that's when that stuff, like those details really matter, and getting more granular matters. And so I think it's just knowing what you need to do or what is demanded of you consistency wise by like being in there, like getting in the arena, doing the thing, seeing how your body responds, and then being able to change intensity from there.
Yeah, yeah. And I love what you said about the intensity and the pace, because I feel like a lot of us would be like, well, why would we not ramp it up? Like, let's do it. But also kind of there's a trade-off, right? Like
Yeah.
if we are ramping it up, we want to see as much progress as possible. Well, we probably got to be pretty specific with our food. So we're going to spend a little bit more time tracking. We're going to spend a little bit more time probably meal prepping, so we're prepared. We might need to be really dedicated to our workouts and, getting our cardio in. We might need to say no to some social events or again, it depends on how quickly you want to see progress and if you want to be super accurate. And some people are like, I don't have anything to do for the next 2 or 3 months. And you're like, cool, like we can do this. But if you are a busy mom, you have a demanding job and you have got social events and you've got happy hours and you don't want to be that strict, that's okay. I had a client of mine, great example. She she's like a social butterfly. She's got like girls' nights, she's got date nights, she's got vacations, she's traveling for work, she's doing all this stuff. But we were still in she's fun. She had 2 glasses of wine every day in December. That's like she has an advent calendar. It's got like a new wine every single day. And I will give her all the credit in the world because she tracked her that was like her thing that she tracked, and then she built the rest of the day around it. Do I suggest that during a fat loss phase? No, but like that's what she wanted to do, and that was a non-negotiable for her. So we're like, cool, let's do it. She was still able to lose 40 pounds with all those social events, concerts, like eating out, all of these things. And you hear that and you're like, wow, that's awesome, right? She's living the dream. She gets to do the, kind of best of both worlds. But in her eyes, her rate of progress was a little bit slower than she would have liked. And that was kind of that trade-off. And we had to have that talk a lot of times because it's like, yes, you're still having days where you don't track, you're still having days where you go out to dinner, and like that is okay as long as you know that your rate of weight loss is going to be a little bit slower.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that that's really important to put out there, and also to think like what is actually going to be realistic. And we talk about fat loss phases being this like kind of get in, get out, but like you don't want to be miserable the entire time, right? Like you still want to make sure your quality of life is still there, or maybe even again you're doing the self coach, but but if you did have a coach, reaching out and be like, hey, how do I incorporate date night? How do I do this and still reach my goals? So there are some things that you can do. And I think that's why she was so successful, because we spent so much time with those foundations that she knew what to do when she went out to eat, when she went on vacation and all these things, so she could still continue to see progress.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think it's also not to misconstrue that like it's this glamorous world of like I'm eating all these things that I love and I'm seeing progress. Obviously, like we play the marketing game. Like we want to advocate that you can have these favorite foods and enjoy them. But I think that sometimes we get too far into the food freedom mindset when we're in a dieting phase that can actually set us back when there is an amount of rigidity and, dare I say, restriction. I actually don't, I'm starting to just like, I don't love labeling restriction as a bad word. Like I think because we play the marketing game, we're like so quick to be like restriction is bad and you shouldn't restrict at all. But I think that restriction creates boundaries, and humans need some form of structure and boundaries in our lives to make our minds and bodies and hearts at peace. And so without any restriction, we'd be haywire, right? That's why like the world has laws and like governing bodies. So I think it's just like having the right amount, right? So, and a healthy amount of restriction can actually give you a lot. It can give you a lot of like mental clarity and freedom and empowerment of like, wow, I said no to this thing and I felt good after, right? So it's not that you have to say yes to the glass of wine all the time either, because that comes with its own trade-offs of like building your day around 2 glasses of wine a day in a calorie deficit. I'm imagining right now, probably not super fun. Like I'm definitely giving up like having carbs with my lunch and like maybe with dinner too. And having to rely on a lot more just like lean proteins, vegetables for the remainder of my meals. But like that's what mattered to her. And it's cool that she was able to do that. But I think it's just don't over glamorize that either.
No, definitely not. Because again, like, I'm saying, oh, concerts and vacation and this and that. And it's like, yeah, but again, she still made sure she prioritized protein. She still made sure that she was getting steps in. She was going to the gym. Like she had all those things in place. And like, it's not like she went out to those events and went ham. Like she was still mindful. And like you said, she still had a little bit of that restriction, like or like those boundaries with herself. Like I'll do this, but I'm not going to go grab Taco Bell afterwards. Like I'm going to go
Yeah.
home and have a protein shake. I'm going to make sure I have a protein bar in my purse. So if I get hungry on the way home, I'm not, so it's like, yeah, again, it's like she was able to still do these things,
Yeah.
but she had some habits and some moderation in place to still make those things make them work. But she still was like, I still wish I saw some more progress. So
Yeah.
again, there is that trade-off.
Yeah. I think you make me think of my client, Jenna Lynn, who travels multiple weekends a month for work. And I think the theme here is just like the more chaotic that your life is, there is a higher level of intentionality and preparedness that you need in order to be successful with your goals in a fat loss phase. That doesn't mean that it's impossible, but it's like, again, it's balancing the chaos of your life, the preparedness that you need, and the rate of progress that you're expecting and wanting. And like there's a toggle board with those three things, right? So it's just picking which battles you want to fight, essentially.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good ending point for part 2.
Oh
So
boy.
yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be good.
Yeah. So hopefully, yeah, I guess we'll need a part 3. When you said that originally, I was like, nah, we can do it in 2. But yeah, so hopefully, you got some good takeaways. And again, if you're like, haven't listened to part 1, like, please go back and listen to part 1. But we hope you enjoyed, part 2 of this series. And if you haven't already, make sure that you're subscribed to our podcast. You can find both of us on Instagram. You can find me at Christy Lynn Fit, and Marissa is at Marissa Roy Fitness. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we hope to see you back next week.